Okay, and we're recording. My name's Jonathan Cohn. I'm the chair of the Issues Committee with Progressive Massachusetts. We're kind of continuing on with our series, which was intended to be live, technical difficulties, not, but exploring the various dimensions of the current kind of pandemic and economic crisis and the short-term and long-term responses needed. I'm delighted to have with me today Yamila, Ruiz, and Tania Lopez from One Fair Wage. Can you both, first, thank you for joining us, and can you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your organization?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jonathan, and to the team at Progressive Massachusetts for the issues that you all advocate for and the direct impact that they have on our communities, especially those who are most vulnerable. My name is Yamila Ruiz. I'm the National High Road Director at One Fair Wage. I oversee a network of over 800 restaurants nationally committed to progressive business practices, sustainable business practices. These are small independent restaurants, some medium-sized restaurants, but for the most part, over 800 restaurants across the country who pre-COVID took a stance that they don't believe in the values of the Massachusetts Restaurant Association, the National Restaurant Association push, which is constantly lobbying for lower wages and for really putting workers in a precarious situation as far as business practices. So these restaurant owners who are a part of this association called RAISE, the acronym is Restaurants Advancing Industry Standards and Employment, promote better business practices, sustainable employment through benefits, opportunities for upward mobility in the restaurant industry, which is rare, and higher wages. These are the ethos of the RAISE restaurants. And here in Massachusetts, we've got great leaders like Josh Lewin and Katrina Jazzieri in Somerville, and their newer restaurant Peregrine in Beacon Hill, Irene Lee from May in Fenway, and as well as Ali Fong from Banh Mi. Those are just some examples of the restaurants who represent our constituency. And RAISE is a program of One Fair Wage, which we'll get into a little bit later on, and we'll talk a little bit more about. And really glad to be joined by our new Massachusetts worker organizer, Tania Lopez, who is also a restaurant worker like myself, and can talk a little bit about her work with restaurant workers here in Massachusetts.
Hi, so my name is Tania Lopez, and I recently joined the One Fair Wage team. I've been helping out with the emergency fund calls here in Massachusetts, where we're trying to help with a cash relief for service workers of $213, and that stands for like the sub minimum wage, that it's $2.13 for some workers who earn that an hour. So I have been calling workers, just hearing their stories and learning more about how we can help them during this difficult time.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you both for all that you're doing. When I was thinking of people to interview, immediately thought of just the issue of how this crisis is hitting restaurants, and especially restaurant workers, with the restaurants themselves either closed entirely, or if not closed entirely, just relying on delivery or other modes of operation where kind of wait staff probably isn't there. Curious to hear from some of the workers that you help organize. What has that direct impact been on them? Like, how have they been dealing with this?
Yeah, Jonathan, we'd love to share some individual stories from our worker membership and from other tipped workers across Massachusetts, but I think it would be really helpful to just talk for a few minutes about the situation that existed pre-COVID. Definitely. And how that lends itself to the devastating situation that we're seeing now. So if it's all right, I'm just going to take 2 minutes to talk about the landscape of the restaurant industry nationally and here in Massachusetts, because I think it's something that is useful to kind of set the tone for the rest of the conversation.
And it's an excellent point, because the one thing that I think it's important for all of us to stress is that kind of for those with whom this is becoming an emergency or crisis situation now, it often already was. And what we're seeing is a lot of the inequalities that existed just in sharper relief, and that the problems that we've seen in sharper relief. So that's a great tag.
Exactly. I'll maybe pitch this later on, but I don't know if you read Arundhati Roy's piece on how the pandemic is a portal to this new world that we've been given the opportunity to dream up, but how all of the issues that we're culminating as a society were kind of this like unhinged train that came off the tracks and has now just been exacerbated by the coronavirus crisis. I really recommend the article if folks are interested in a long form read, and also one of my favorite authors. So yeah, just to get into it really, the restaurant industry pre-COVID was one of the country's largest and fastest growing sectors of our economy. We were reaching the 14 million mark before March 13th, which is kind of known as like D-Day in the restaurant industry. It's when many restaurants starting in New York City and across the country were forced to shutter. But as I said, it represents one of the largest and fastest growing sectors of our economy. We employ over nearly 14 million workers, and a large majority of these workers are women of color, people of color, they're immigrants, they're both college educated and high school students, they're career servers, just like, there's the restaurant industry really is like a microcosm for the rest of the world. It's immensely diverse, the workforce. But as a result, there's a lot of low-paying jobs. Every year, the Department of Labor puts out a report on the lowest-paying jobs, and every year the restaurant industry proudly occupies the largest number of lowest-paying jobs. 7 out of 10 of the lowest-paying jobs in the U.S. economy are typically restaurant industry jobs, jobs like dishwasher, bar back, and a large percentage of those jobs are tipped service occupations. So that means that what is a tipped subminimum wage? In 43 states, there's a federal subminimum wage of $2.13, or the state has a higher subminimum wage that is less than the full minimum wage.
And remind us what happened, since we just had a minimum wage increase a few years ago. Remind us of what happened and how that affected tipped workers.
Yeah, so as you know, in Massachusetts, part of the grand bargain compromise was that minimum wage was passed, a higher minimum wage was passed, paid family medical leave was passed. As you know, a lot of folks who were part of the Raise Up Coalition worked really hard to pass these great strides for Massachusetts workers. But sadly, a large percentage of low-wage earners were left out, and these are tipped workers. And to clarify, I think it's a very common misconception that workers who live off tips are mostly restaurant workers. While restaurant workers do make up a large part of that population, there's also many other industries that rely on a sub-minimum wage. So it's not just restaurant. While we represent, Raise represents the restaurant industry, One Fair Wage campaign has actually, I'll talk a little bit about how the campaign is involved, but we started off realizing that this was thinking that this was a restaurant industry issue, but as we talked to other groups like nail salon worker advocates, car wash worker advocates, advocates for airport workers and workers with disabilities, these are all groups that earn a sub-minimum wage. And for many of these industries, it's the understanding is that the employer will make up the difference between the lower sub-minimum wage and the overall minimum wage. Well, that is the law. There's often non-compliance of this, frankly. Under the Obama era, they did an investigation and found that there was an 84% non-compliance rate of restaurants, for example, not making up the difference between the lower sub-minimum wage and the overall minimum wage. Because if you don't earn that threshold with tips, the employer is supposed to make up the difference and pay you out at the end of this. So that was one of the parts of the grand compromise, was that workers are going to end up, while everybody else gets to $15 an hour, tipped workers are going to cap out at about $6.75 in 2023. And so that's actually one of the largest gaps in the country. So here in Massachusetts, as you said earlier in our conversation, we've got a Democratic supermajority, as you mentioned, yet we're going to be facing by 2023, if things don't change, one of the largest gaps between the sub-minimum wage and the overall minimum wage, which is, which is to actually mention a literal legacy of slavery. The first tipped workers in America were newly freed slaves who were hired to largely to work on the railroads and not be paid anything at all because of this notion that, business owners at the time couldn't fathom paying newly freed slaves. So they hired them and said, you can come work for me, but your wage will come from customers' tips. It was like a skewed version of the European feudalist noblesse oblige, which was always supposed to which was always meant to be an extra on top of a wage, but not a wage replacement. And that's where it came to America, like many things, and got essentially skewed and translated into this notion of a sub-minimum wage that we have today, which was a $0 wage then, and it's gone from a $0 wage after emancipation of slavery to a whopping $2.13 at the federal level. And really, it's a shame that we have a literal legacy of slavery codified essentially into our laws. And not just that, the problematic, systemic racist issues of slavery, but also this legacy of slavery, but also the fact that it's in essence legislative pay inequity, because when you look at who makes up the majority of the tipped workforce, you have almost 70% of that workforce working women of color. Across Massachusetts, right? The notion that the Restaurant Association likes to paint is that like most servers are wealthy servers working in Back Bay, earning $40, $50 an hour, when the reality is that the majority of the workforce works in quick casual family style restaurants across the state, in IHOPs, Applebee's. And what we're trying to do through One Fair Wage and through our advocacy is ensure that the restaurants that are able, yes, look, every restaurant needs universal relief, but the restaurants that are able to survive this crisis, there should be a different kind of specific targeted relief to restaurants that are part of, for example, Ruiz, our employer association, who are committed to a $15 minimum wage, who are committed to phasing out a sub-minimum wage, this literal legacy of slavery, who are committed to paying, who providing benefits to their teams and providing the ability to become upwardly mobile, because that's another issue that we saw in the restaurant industry prior to COVID is it's really hard to move up in the restaurant industry. If you're a really good busser, the employer will keep you as a busboy for 15 years without the opportunity to move up into those higher paying, as we call them, from the tier 2 positions to the tier 1 higher paying occupations in the restaurant. So as we, we're talking about earlier, the issues existed in the restaurant industry. What COVID-19 has done is essentially lifted the veil, because what we're finding now is when many tipped workers are applying for unemployment, they simply don't meet the threshold because they're getting such a lower sub-minimum wage, or they haven't been working at the job long enough, because we have one of the highest turnover rates out of any sector in America. Or they were piecing together 2 or 3 jobs. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just quickly, that was a point that was when I was thinking of questions I wanted to ask, how this intersects with unemployment insurance, because I feel like the design of unemployment insurance it has like a very specific kind of idea of somebody working a stable job, 40 hours a week in like a traditional employer-employee relationship. And how does that system work or not work for tipped workers, and does any of the newly passed federal legislation help change that at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did a survey back in 2015 and 2016 where we talked to almost 500 restaurant workers across Boston to get a sense of the landscape. There's very little data that exists besides the Bureau of Labor Statistics. A lot of the Restaurant Association data is what's used for shaping policy, and that's problematic because we know what their interests are, right? So we did our own survey. It was a member-led participatory survey. It's actually how I got involved with the organization. I was a member leader working on the survey collection. I worked in the restaurant industry myself. I worked in the industry for 10 years in the North Shore of Massachusetts and throughout Boston. And I got involved with the work through that survey collection process. Well, what we found after talking to over 500 restaurant workers and doing in-depth interviews with workers and owners is that most workers who work in the restaurant industry piece together 2, 3, 4 jobs to make ends meet because sorry, I was just getting a phone call. Because they frankly can't get full-time employment. It's the part-timization of our economy that's existed for so long. And that affects unemployment insurance because they're piecing together work hours from 2 or 3 jobs. They are living off a sub-minimum wage. The huge problem with being a tipped service worker is that many employers underreport the amount of tips. So the reporting is largely inaccurate. Unemployment insurance is supposed to be calculated on a sub-minimum wage plus a gross calculation of your tips. But like I said, the reporting is not there either from the owner perspective or the individual worker reporting for whatever reason, inaccurate amount of tips. Some of them are cash tips. So how do you factor cash income into an unemployment insurance calculation?
Yeah.
So we've had employers who have come to us and said, you know, we were like on the fence or didn't really fully understand the whole threshold or like the ramifications of one fair wage. But now that my workers are applying for unemployment insurance and getting denied, I understand. Like now I understand why it made sense why it was the right thing to do all along is to pay one fair wage. They're kind of like seeing the light, and it's sadly kind of like a awakening, but at the same time, we're talking to these employers. We're trying to, sorry to kind of digress from your original question, but we're trying to partner up. I think it lends itself to like what we're seeing and what we're doing in response of the crisis. We're trying to partner with these employers to appeal to the governor and to appeal to Governor Baker. If you're listening and listening to Progressive Massachusetts,
our number one fan,
your number one fan. No, but we're trying to appeal to the governor to let him know that yes, small businesses need relief, but the types of jobs that we should be investing in are the types of employers who are committed to long-term sustainable business practices under this umbrella of, you know, quote unquote conscious capitalism that we're trying to promote. And we've talked at the federal level to Senator Warren's folks about including this in some sort of package 4, because we know the CARES Act was not enough. It was not enough for small businesses. It left out a large population of the restaurant industry, folks who don't have access to traditional unemployment or any other benefits because of their status, because of everything we talked about, the part-timization, the gig economy workers. And I do want to touch on that note really quickly. So as I was getting into, the restaurant industry was the reason that the One Fair Wage campaign started, but last year, and that started as a part of the Restaurant Opportunity Center, United, our national policy initiatives. But last year, after doing research, we published a report called The Gig is Up, and it talks about how gig economy workers are also now being paid a sub-minimum wage, and that many companies like DoorDash, Instacart are reverting, who were previously paying one fair wage, a full minimum wage, which we know is not a living wage, reverting back to the sub-minimum wage when they realized that if they introduced tipping, workers could essentially get subsidized by the customer, by the consumer, through tipping. And so our campaign last fall, we brought together a coalition of these advocates from other sectors, from the nail salon workers in New York, the car wash workers union, our DWSU, advocates for workers with disabilities, and organizations who are also trying to organize gig economy workers, Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, Instacart workers. And we came together and realized it's the same issue that we're all facing, an issue that we thought originated with the restaurant industry, but is now spreading. And as the face of retail changes, right now you're faced with like an Apple Pay screen every time you go to check out at a retail point of sale establishment. You're prompted to tip on like a $2 bottle of water. As that increases, companies are trying to institute ways to pay workers less. And so we expanded the campaign to include these other sectors. It is largely viewed as a restaurant issue, but all these other sectors are in part affected, and we'll just continue to see this grow.
And it reminded me as well, like the kind of DoorDash and Instacart workers are especially at risk now when you're kind of looking at the fact of you have the kind of the twin issues that you're seeing now with the kind of economic crisis of the workers who are at risk because they're not able to go to work and they're kind of losing on the income, and those who are forced to work in unsafe conditions.
Absolutely.
So there's like the people kind of working for Instacart or DoorDash are being sent to do the shopping for people who themselves don't want to have to actually go to the stores. And then
when we talk about, institutional systemic racism, largely it's Black and brown workers who are doing these jobs and without the proper equipment. But they have no choice. It's folks who, my brother used to drive Uber and Lyft. It's folks who previously drove Uber and Lyft and are now trying to get an income through through these platforms. And yeah, it's just, I mean, the answer that we know that we needed all along are paid sick days that are actually enforced, paid family medical leave, which is enforced, a fair full minimum wage that includes one fair wage for tipped workers, and so many other things, universal rent relief, all these other things. Is like the answers that we progressives in Massachusetts have been advocating for years, decades, are now, it's like, this is what we've been talking about all along. The issue, the crisis that we talked about when we talked about the need for paid family medical leave. Now it happened to every single household in Massachusetts, not just one, the doomsday scenario that we talked about back then. So yeah, sorry, go ahead. We kind of
one thing you were talking about what Governor Baker could be doing. So if what are some of the next steps that say that Charlie Baker or the Massachusetts legislature could do, like if they wanted to, they could do tomorrow to improve the situation?
Great question. Yeah, great question. So we're actually calling on New York Governor Cuomo, who we've been working on the One Fair Wage campaign in some time. We're calling on Governor Charlie Baker to pass one fair wage for all workers. So no worker is ever in the scenario where they find themselves without unemployment insurance at a massive scale. I've got the numbers here from our letter to the Baker. Upwards of 470,000 workers have already been laid off across the state in the restaurant industry, and forecasters predict that that number will increase by another 150,000 by summer. This is an issue that is not going to be until May, as our president would like to have us believe. This is not an issue that's going to be until June. Many restaurants sadly won't survive this, but those that do, we need to make sure that we don't end up in a dystopian future where there's only Olive Gardens and Chili's that can survive this. We need to make sure we're investing in the small businesses who are part of our association or who are willing to work with us in the time that they're closed to implement. We've got a training and technical assistance program, and so we're inviting restaurants to work with us to implement our gender equity, racial equity training curriculum while they're closed. Actually, Boston City Councilor Lydia Edwards and Councilor Wu and Councilor Mejia introduced a municipal city council resolution to say that high road businesses should be given specific targeted relief in the form of either rent abatement or payroll tax incentives to be able to make sure that these small businesses committed to fair business practices are able to survive this crisis. So the first step would be to pass one fair wage in an ideal world. And the second step would be to give additional targeted relief to businesses willing to work with us to implement a business model that is able to survive this crisis and the next one, should we have it, to create a restaurant industry and economy, really, because the restaurant industry, as I talked about, is one of the largest and fastest growing sectors of our economy that works for everybody.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that you're raising about how when you do have businesses that adopt pro-worker policies tend to be more resilient businesses in general.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I've talked to some of our high road members across the state, and in the weeks after everything's been happening, we kind of did like emergency rapid response, trying to get all of the resources out as quickly as we can, which, by the way, on Tuesday, what we were hearing in the first few weeks was like irrelevant by Thursday because things were moving so quickly. But it was really interesting to hear from one business owner in particular who was like, yeah, part of our open book management strategy is planning for financial disaster, obviously not to this scale that we thought that they didn't think that every single restaurant in the state would be going through this. But it's just interesting because the number one argument for against one fair wage is, well, restaurants operate on such thin profit margins, and there's really no like room to increase labor costs or any change any sort of like traditional behavior. And it's like, well, maybe then what is fundamentally wrong is the way business and restaurants operate in America, and maybe it's poor business planning. A lot of people, sadly, set out to open restaurants because of like the romanticized idea of running a restaurant and the like Top Chef kind of appeal. But there's a lot of work that goes into creating a sustainable restaurant. And there's people who have been able to do it really well in Boston, across the state, in Western Massachusetts, using either cooperative or open book management or different models that are unique, but that lead to lower turnover, increased staff retention, a greater sense of team, more cross-training. It helps to desegregate the industry when you have folks being willing to like pitch in and not feel like, they're only confined to work the front of the house or the back of the house. We see a great racial disparity between front of the house and back of the house workers, but restaurants that have been able to successfully implement one fair wage, which means a full minimum wage plus tips. I think a lot of people get confused that one fair wage means eliminating tips. It doesn't. California and the 7 other states that have one fair wage pay a full fair minimum wage with tips on top. Now, some folks choose to distribute that differently. So that means that if they're paying a full minimum wage, in 2018, we passed a federal law that says that if you're paying a full minimum wage, you can share tips with the back of the house, which we believe in. We believe in the ability to share tips with the back of the house and distribute that wealth accordingly. But then there's different models, right? Like the hospitality included model, which is Danny Meyer and a few other restaurateurs that means no tipping. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of different ways to achieve one fair wage, whether it's hospitality included or paying a full wage and then sharing with the back of the house, or a service charge model. We've seen different ways to get to the same common goal.
And your points reminded me as well of how the U.S. is at least like unique when looking at like in a number of countries in having sub minimum wages here.
Exactly.
Because like if you ever to like travel kind of abroad to Europe, like restaurant workers tend to be paid far better and don't have to have sub minimum wages, and people do still tip, and so like they're not reliant on as much for tips as workers would be here, but people do still tip extra, just kind of in recognition of service.
And at the end of the day that at least if nobody walks in the door, you're going to be walking home with a paycheck that's reflective of the hours that you worked, not the amount of customers that came in the door. It's interesting. We're actually, not to digress too much, but it fits very much in line with the 4 goals of progressive Massachusetts that you talked about, of shared prosperity, of a commitment to racial and social justice, of promoting good government, and lastly, the environmental protection and sustainable agriculture. That 4th piece is something that's a really interesting intersection with the reliance off of tips. We're actually participating in the Earth Day Live 3 days of programming with the youth climate organizations. And they invited us to come and do a presentation about how climate change, interestingly enough, affects tipped service workers. I remember that was one of the reasons why I not quote unquote left, but shifted my efforts to organizing. Was one of the last winters was that really bad winter we had in Massachusetts that I worked as a tipped service worker. And for a month, do you remember we had a storm like every Monday for like a whole month? Yeah. Nobody came in the door and I was reliant on tips. And so how am I supposed to make rent on March 1st? And that seems like a lifetime ago. It was like 6 years ago. If nobody's come in the door for the entire month of February, because I'm reliant on those tips, right? On how many people walk in the door, and otherwise I go home with nothing. You make maybe $50 for the week.
So I know earlier you were talking about how you recently had a teletown hall with some of the workers you were working with. What are some of the things that you learned from that it would be important for people?
Yeah, so we've had a series of these teletown halls, and Tania can speak to the emergency fund a little bit more because she's been working on the front lines there. But after it was becoming very clear that workers in the restaurant industry were going to be laid off in massive numbers, and across other service sectors, Uber, Lyft drivers, and nail salon workers, and all service workers, we decided to launch an emergency fund. To date, we've raised over $12 million for over 100,000 applicants. Here in Massachusetts, we've had, I want to say, almost 6,000 applicants, 5,700 workers applied to our emergency fund. And this is, as Tania mentioned, immediate cash assistance of $213 grants, no strings attached. again, as she mentioned, to signify the $213 subminimum wage. Our goal was to help as many workers, even with just a week of groceries or a bill, as we could. And it really took off. We've had tremendous support from individual donors, foundational donors, but sadly, we've also had a just groundswell of cries for help from workers who were already living paycheck to paycheck, or as our co-founder and president said, tip to mouth. The tips ended on Friday, and by Monday they didn't have food to feed their families, right? Because they were counting on that Saturday, Sunday paycheck, and it just didn't happen. So we're hearing from a lot of workers who don't qualify for traditional benefits, who aren't going to be getting a stimulus check. They're not going to be getting any sort of government relief, and they make up the majority of our workforce. Where they're really scared. Their resilience has really come through. The restaurant industry is known as being a really resilient industry, where it's, you're in the weeds, as we call it. It's really hard manual labor. You're on your feet for 14, 15 hours a day. There's been a lot of great silver linings of restaurant workers coming together to provide community mutual aid. Here in Lynn, where I live, I'm working with a few restaurant workers who are trying to provide food and other emergency supplies to other restaurant workers in the North Shore. And I think when you ask about like short-term and long-term solutions, sure, there's the policy solutions that we'd love to see Governor Baker pass one fair wage, or to support high road restaurants tomorrow, which he's able to do. But beyond that, in the short term, I think community mutual aid is going to be what's going to be lifting people out of these situations. Is just everybody pitching in a little bit. We started a essentially food pantry out of our garage a month ago when we realized how this is happening. We've been able to help 12 families here in Lynn and a few in Revere, Massachusetts, with food donations. But I think just the resilience of the restaurant industry is really one is really what stuck out to me. The stories, maybe Tania can share a little bit on the stories of the calls to individual workers. So what we do is we have to call them to essentially do an intake to make sure that they were actually restaurant workers before this and that they qualify for our funding. But we use that as an opportunity, right? An organizing opportunity to be able to connect them with other resources in the community that they might not be aware of. I can tell you, when I worked in the restaurant industry, I was so busy, like closing and opening shifts. I was not used to filling out paperwork or forms because you just don't have time. You're like, go, working 2-3 jobs. And so connecting folks with resources who might have not either filed taxes or applied for similar forms for unemployment before, if they're eligible. Tania, maybe you can share a little bit about like any individual stories that stuck out to you as you've been making calls, if you're comfortable.
Yeah. So I recently started making calls in Massachusetts, and I think some of the stories that have really shaken me was this one in particular of this server. She was a mother, and she had a daughter. She was able to qualify for unemployment, but was unable to get it because she did not earn enough. So hearing her story, it made me feel just angry, about the unfairness of this, and how there needs to be something done in order for these people to be able to access some money from government. And she was really upset. I also had heard from others that they reach out to their representatives, so I told her to do the same. But we also made sure that she will get the money immediately because she did not have anything for groceries. And when we hear stories like this, we make sure that we are able to process the cash relief faster for them. So I will manage to do that. And I also send her more resources as well from other organizations that so she could apply for as well. And something she also told me was, that she loved her job. Like she wants to go back. She misses it. She said she loves working with people. She loves what she does. But it's now to this point, she realized how unfair it is, and the treatment that she got from her employer, like to not be able to give her more support, knowing that this had happened. That story was really powerful.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing? Like,
yeah.
this is that Tania brought up. This is the most widespread tragic situation to ever happen to our industry, our country, our world. But as an organizer, I've never seen 500,000 pissed off restaurant workers as we're seeing in Massachusetts right now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, as an organizer, the opportunity to, you know, goal number one is to agitate around the current conditions. I mean, now we're seeing not to politicize it, but now we're seeing agitation on a global scale, of workers really realizing, and we're seeing comments in our teletown halls, which you mentioned that we've been hosting, like, one fair wage or we don't go back to work, you know, like workers getting really riled up to say, like, things have to change. We're not going back. We're not going back to the like old normal. This is an opportunity to create long-lasting systemic change, which starts with passing one fair wage, but really creating one fair wage is not just about raising workers' wages, but it's creating a sense of dignity and respect. Because how, as a worker, do you feel when you're paid 2/3 of a paycheck, 1/3 of a, you know, of the regular minimum wage, when you're paid, you know, 1/3 of what other folks are paid? That gets to you in your sense of self and worth. And so one fair wage is about professionalizing and creating dignity in the restaurant industry. And yeah, I just want to say, I want to encourage workers to apply to the ofwemergencyfund.org. We're still taking applications. We haven't closed. Many other funds have closed, but we're just setting the bar high. At first we said, okay, there's 14 million restaurant workers. We want to raise $14 million. Now that we're at the 12 million mark, it's like, we got to keep fundraising. We got to keep helping more workers.
Yes. Yeah, and is that the emergency fund that you were talking about? How can people want to contribute to the emergency fund?
Yes, yes, monetary contributions are great. You can go to ofwemergencyfund.org and you'll see the opportunity, you'll see different tabs. One says get help, the other one says donate. But what we could really use are volunteers to help Tania with these calls, because we've got a network of great volunteers here in Massachusetts who have worked on Raise Up and the No on 2 campaign, or are familiar with phone banking. But if there's volunteers at home watching, we could really use your help. Tania can help do weekly trainings with volunteers. We've gotten some, not refugees, but what's the word? Ex-volunteers from the different presidential campaigns
okay, nice.
Come help us. Andrew Yang's group of the Yang Gang, like, we're early on, like, sent a bunch of, like, hundreds of volunteers our way to help with the national calls. Yeah. Some of Elizabeth Warren's volunteers and Senator Sanders' volunteers have been helping us. Anybody, if you're able to access a laptop and able to make calls to get workers their money, we could really, really use the help to do so. That way we can help more people. And so, yeah, just go on ofwemergencyfund.org and you'll see the different options to get help, donate, or volunteer.
Awesome. And then Tania, any other stories that have stuck out to you as you've been talking with?
Yeah.
Calls?
So, I mean, the ones that, you know, do qualify for unemployment are unable to get it because of their wages. And also just people that are unable to qualify for unemployment and have been working in the industry for a while, and because they don't have the proper documents, they are unable to do so. So there was one who was an Uber driver, and he said that he knew more Uber drivers who continue working after, you know, the law was established not to go out anymore. And he said that he didn't want to risk it going back to work or trying to find a new job because one of his friends had died from coronavirus. And I think that it also shows that, you know, some people are unable to not be able to have an income right now. They continue to search to find job opportunities and be able to provide their family because they don't qualify for unemployment, and yet they're also putting themselves at risk with the coronavirus.
We're asking folks to submit their stories as we're talking with them, you know, doing these intakes. We've also invited workers to join us, as we talked about just earlier, on these national teletown halls. So the first national one we did was with Senator Kamala Harris and with Representative Pramila Jayapal, talking about exactly what was in the CARES Act, what were the shortcomings of the CARES Act, what resources workers can seek out. and what the federal government is doing, to improve on that third package. And then since then, we did one with in Pennsylvania with Pennsylvania service workers and the Attorney General there. We're doing one with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. In order to watch that, you can tune into or like the Service Workers United for Power page. That's the page that we've created to connect all the applicants. And it's actually going to be different than a virtual teletown hall. It's actually a virtual rally about service workers rising up for change, demanding action from the legislature, from the state, to create a better system than the one that we found ourselves in before. And in those teletown halls, we're asking workers to share their stories, living off tips, and how coronavirus has affected them on a national, in this national platform. And so some worker stories will be featured there. We invite folks to join us for that. And she's a former service worker herself, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, so she can speak to this. She actually spoke at an event that we did last year and highlighted, the issue that many women face that we didn't talk about too much in this last hour, but it's a big component of our work, that women are forced to put up with whatever a customer might do or say to them in order to earn a tip, because they don't have a full minimum wage to rely on. So what we found is that states that have a full fair minimum wage have lower rates of sexual harassment. So here's this actual proven policy initiative that we can take to drastically reduce sexual harassment in the workplace. And it's not just about drastically reducing sexual harassment in the workplace in the restaurant industry, but it's actually the fact that many women's first jobs are restaurant service work. And so that serves as a barometer as to what is acceptable in the workplace. It was my first job as a 14-year-old. And so I learned early on that it's okay to have somebody come and grope you or have somebody say something really inappropriate as a 14-year-old, right? And so that we've talked to judges, we've talked to legislators who have said, I was harassed in my career as an attorney, but it was never as bad as when it was in the restaurant industry, so I thought it was okay, right? So it sets the stage for people throughout their lives, and this is something that we really need to fight to change.
Which is an excellent point. I know Rock had a report like a couple of years ago about that, about how widespread it is in the industry.
Yeah, the glass floor is the name of the report that highlights sexual harassment in the restaurant industry. The New York Times actually did a big feature article about sexual harassment in the restaurant industry and the reliance on tips. The New York Times editorial board came out in full support of passing one fair wage at the federal level and in New York. So that's also a good piece.
Nice. Thinking about how many states in the U.S. have already embraced the idea of one fair wage?
So seven states, including California, Oregon, Washington, the entire West Coast. Alaska. Interestingly enough, Alaska has the highest rates of tipping in the country, and they are one fair wage state. And also Nevada and Minnesota.
Nice. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's
Montana.
Very much
Sorry, I forgot Montana. I always forget Montana.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, kind of an interesting mix of states. And I would like to think that people in Massachusetts would like for our state to be at least as progressive as the state of Alaska.
Exactly. I mean, that's something that really baffles me. And it really speaks to the power and the influence of the National Restaurant Association, because you've got progressive states like New York, like Massachusetts, who we've been fighting for one fair wage for 5 or 6 years, have brought this issue to the national attention. At the state level, we've introduced legislation in Massachusetts with Senator Jalen and Representative Carly Bouvier for the last 3 sessions. So for 6 years, we've been bringing it to the legislature. Here's a proven policy solution that could drastically cut sexual harassment in half. It would allow workers the stability to be able to budget and plan and be eligible for unemployment insurance in the face of a disaster. Like I said, we've been saying this for years and years. Yet you have these states who, because all they hear from the restaurants are, oh no, the sky will fall, there's no way we can do this. Yet in California, you have one of the best restaurant economies in the country. And yes, there will be a period that will be an adjustment period, but we don't recommend going to $15 overnight, especially because we have such a large gap in Massachusetts. We actually believe in a phase-in that, while it's a really hard choice to make, for workers especially, could really benefit for more hourly pay. We believe in a phase-in that's like 7 or 8 years. So not going to one fair wage overnight. What we're talking about with businesses who are willing to work with us while they're closed is committing to go to one fair wage next year and doing it slowly over 5 years, making that commitment to both raise our wages and then go through our racial equity and gender equity training to be better employers. Yeah. So, it's just frustrating because Massachusetts leads the way on so many things, but here we are with the largest gap between the sub-minimum wage and the overall minimum wage in the country.
I think your talk about like the businesses kind of crying wolf, or the sky is falling when it comes to like improving labor practices. It speaks to the fact that like being able to creatively innovate is what you expect of businesses, and all like is what businesses say is their greatest strength most of the time. So if they're able to creatively adapt and innovate, they can creatively adapt and innovate while still paying their workers a decent wage. That should be something that they are able to adapt to if they are a good business.
Yeah, and also, you know what? Labor costs are high. You know what else is high? Rent costs. There's so many things that go into a business. Why is it always that workers' wages are the first thing that a company tries to undercut, right?
Yeah.
And if collectively, it's really hard for one business. That's why I so admire the Juliets, the Banh Mi's, the Maymays of Massachusetts that are leading the way, because they're doing this without the state having to tell them to do it. And so they're already putting themselves at a competitive disadvantage, but it is in line with their business philosophy. They say, we don't believe in having a business that undercuts our workers' wages or puts them at an inability to provide for their families. If so, we wouldn't want to be in business.
And they're able to be successful doing it.
Yeah, Juliet and Peregrine. Juliet, I know, was voted like the top 50 new restaurants when they opened and have gotten accolades in the Globe and Bon Appetit and other national publications. These are companies that are not, just flying under the radar, but they're well-known companies. Banh Mi started with one food truck, and now they've grown to 6 or 7 brick and mortars and food trucks, and all the while pledging, like 5 years ago, before 15 for all was even a thing, pledging to go to 15 for all.
Oh, wow. That's impressive.
Yeah.
And it's especially good to support businesses like that during the downturn, so that the businesses that have already been doing well by their workers can survive.
Yeah. If I can give one more plug, May is actually feeding healthcare workers. They've taken it upon themselves, even though business is slow. They're providing meals for first responders, healthcare workers, nurses, and doctors in a lot of the restaurants, because they're in the Fenway area, close to Longwood. So I'm sorry, not for restaurants, for healthcare workers. And we're hoping to, through this concept, which I won't bore you too much, but we're trying to do something similar with our High Road Kitchens concept to engage High Road members of our association to do 2 things: provide meals for those who need it, service workers who are out of work, healthcare workers who are on the front lines, and also reemploy some of their staff through actually federal wage subsidy dollars that were set up in 2009 under the Obama the AIRS Act.
Yeah.
And so it gives municipalities the ability to provide workforce subsidy dollars. And so we're piloting this in Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, hopefully Sacramento and San Jose soon. And with Governor Newsom's support, might make it a California statewide program. We're also talking to the city of New York, the city of Boston, DC, and other localities to pilot this with High Road restaurants to create both food access and also to reemploy people. And so we've got a lot of support with that.
Which I think the reemployment is such a key point, that to make that, like, people who might not be able to work now need jobs once it becomes time when restaurants can open again. And that we need to have the systems in place to make sure that those restaurants do in fact hire people back.
Exactly. The commitment. But It's tough. It's tough because we're hearing from Congress members a real reluctance to bail out an entire industry. And so if we have to make the difficult decision that not everybody is going to get universal relief while it's necessary, it should be prioritizing those businesses that have done like you said, done right by their workers all along. So like I said, we don't end up in a dystopian future where there's only Olive Gardens and IHOPs that can survive, because I don't want to live in that world.
For good reason.
Not any disrespect, because the workers at those places are amazing, but the corporations that are, the head of the National Restaurant Association, Darden Company, lobbies for, year after year, lower wages and not passing basic, occupational safety and health laws to protect their workers.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And so as we wrap up, I want to say, like, how can people stay connected and kind of to learn more about the campaigns that One Fair Wage is doing, to help volunteer? Kind of what are the best ways for people to plug in and stay connected?
Yeah, I would say definitely check out our ofwemergencyfund.org. You can like our Facebook page, which is just One Fair Wage. And then we've also created a separate Facebook page for Massachusetts folks who want to get involved, service workers. It's called Service Workers United for Power Massachusetts. And that's where you can stay up to date on this teletown hall, which we're hoping to do with Massachusetts legislators, probably within the next 2 weeks, I would say. We're going to invite, supportive Boston City councilors and state electeds and even a Congress member to join us for that. So stay tuned, follow our One Fair Wage page and the Service Workers United for Power page. And more than anything too, I would say just share the information of the plight of tipped workers and service workers across the country. I think the largest part that we're missing as, the campaign grows is the consumer support. If we had a groundswell of support similar to like the organic food movement or other efforts that have been successful in creating real change in how we do capitalism in America, it would be beautiful to see an outpouring of consumer support, supporting restaurants that are committed to doing right by their workers, and putting pressure on companies who don't take the high road but take the low road, as we call it.
Awesome. Well, can I say thank both of you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you for highlighting the issues that restaurant workers are going through right now in Massachusetts. Thank you for, always advocating for progressive values and for creating a commonwealth here in Massachusetts that we're all proud to be a part of. And really looking forward to seeing what else you guys feature in these next few interview series.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you again for all of the great work that you do and continue to do and will continue doing.
Thanks so much. Take care, stay safe and healthy.
You too.